Okay, thank you. So, hello everybody. Hello to Kate. How are you?
Hey Ryan, good to see you, friend. How are things?
It's great to see you, and things are looking up. So welcome everybody. I'm Ryan Calo, and I am so excited to host this conversation with Kate Crawford about her wonderful book, which is, I'm sure you know, Atlas of AI. And I'm so excited about this book. It's just I'm so excited to talk to you about it. So just readable and wise and just wonderful. So I'm excited to jump into it. But before I do that, I want to say that this conversation between Kate and I is hosted by the University of Washington, and specifically by the Center for an Informed Public, which is an interdisciplinary research center that works on misinformation and disinformation, as well as the Tech Policy Lab, which is another interdisciplinary research center here at the university that focuses on emerging technology and policy. And so we're delighted, both organizations, to welcome you. And so, big thanks to Corinne, and also to Alex with the Tech Policy Lab, and to Julia and Michael with the center for making this possible. I myself am a law professor at the University of Washington, and I hold adjunct appointments in computer science and information science. And I'm one of the principals of each of those organizations of the center and the lab. My guest is Kate Crawford. And Kate Crawford, let me tell you a little bit about her. I could spend the whole hour talking about her accomplishments, but I'll just limit myself to a couple minutes. Just to say that she's a research professor of communication and STS, of Science and Technology Studies, at USC Annenberg. She is also a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research in New York. And she's the inaugural visiting chair for AI and Justice at the École Normale. I'm going to say this completely wrong, but could you say it for us? I know you know how to say it.
I wish my French were as good as it should be, but it's the École Normale Supérieure.
It's the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, which is, of course, a premier educational institution in France and in Europe. She also holds various other distinguished positions. Really, truly, she is a celebrated academic on at least 3 continents, and also a scholar, of course, but an artist, a musician, and a personal friend. So, Kate, welcome, and I'm so glad to be able to talk to you today.
Ryan, it's such a pleasure to be here. And it just, I want to say a big thank you to the Center for the Informed Public, and also to Tech Policy Lab, which has been doing such important work in this space for a long time. A space that you co-founded, and I think has been such a leading light on these issues. And it's just fantastic to see you. So thank you for inviting me.
Great. Like I said, I mean, this book, I know it sounds just maybe a strange thing to say. I've heard many people say it. It's a page turner. It's an academic, deeply researched book, but it's a page turner. It's hard to put down, and I'm serious. I was actually a bit surprised. And so it's just really, I couldn't recommend it enough. And so one of the things you really emphasize in the book is the need to ask hard questions about AI. Right. And so one of the hard questions about AI I have for you is, what is AI? Like, what the heck is AI? Right. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that scoping question?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, of course, because the term has such a long history. We can go back to its inception around the 1950s during the Dartmouth Conference, but even earlier, it starts to circulate. And it's come to mean many different things over the course of the decades. But the thing that's most common these days, and it's one of my favorite tests, is if you type artificial intelligence into a search engine and just do an image search, what you tend to get is rows and rows of images of numbers floating in blue space, and sort of men wearing glasses staring into the middle distance, and lots of white robots, actually, Ryan. I think that's something
yes.
that you and I have commented on the past, that they're all white and they're all robots. It's really this kind of view from nowhere. It's this algorithmic abstraction that I think really disguises the way that artificial intelligence is actually constructed. So for me, for many years, I've been describing artificial intelligence as a combination of, yes, techniques, there are sort of technical approaches, but there are also social practices. How is it made inside labs? How are all of the types of people working on these systems throughout the supply chain part of making AI? And then it's also these infrastructures. Some of those infrastructures are large technical infrastructures, some of them are political infrastructures, some of them are economic infrastructures. When you start to look at all these things, it's very clear that AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. It's a profoundly material technology, that is made from enormous amounts of natural resources, both sort of mineralogically, but also in terms of just the raw energy that it takes to power these systems. It's made from enormous amounts of exploited labor. Again, we can think about crowd workers, but there are many different types of labor that often aren't thought about in terms of how AI is made. And of course, vast amounts of data. So really thinking about AI much more broadly as an extractive industry for the 21st century is really the way that I've come to think of it after sort of think about this term, artificial intelligence.
Indeed. One of the funny things to me about studying robots, right, is that robots have been around for an exceptionally long period of time. Like there's like references to like an antiquity, to robots, and yet somehow they always are symbols of the future. They've been symbols of the future for forever. But artificial intelligence, as you point out, I mean, though it is sometimes depicted with some futuristic robot, it's like this disembodied thing, this ethereal thing. So
Right.
I want to follow up on this idea of materiality, right? And so when I was reading your book, I really could not help but make a parallel in my mind to Silent Spring, the book by Rachel Carson, from the 1960s. The parallels are actually quite striking. I mean, for example, she's describing the use of chemicals that were developed in a military context, but then ultimately used domestically, where the impacts were kind of tamped down and policed, by rhetoric and the like. And so there's certain commonalities. But one of the things that you really foreground in this book and in your prior work is that AI's materiality and in fact its environmental impact, right? And so I remember even a few years ago your Anatomy of an AI, which was this sort of beautiful art, but also an intervention and pedagogic all at once, where you were exploring that materiality. So I guess I would like to ask you or hear from you, like what are some of these impacts that we don't understand about AI, and why don't we understand them? Why is the materiality and the environmental impact hidden from most people?
Well, I mean, thank you for this question, because Rachel Carson is an extraordinary thinker who I think she transformed landscapes, and that book is coming on in fact next year it will be 60 years old, and it was one of those moments where Carson really took a series of practices that had been completely normalized. So the biocides, as she calls them, just like pouring, these kinds of layers of chemicals through the environment, and really traced them through a much sort of longer set of paths to say, how is this affecting humans? How is it affecting birds? How is it affecting our entire ecology? And that's, a difficult thing to do, particularly because these things are invisible, where she's looking at a set of things that you can't see in the environment, but they're having these long-term impacts. And in many ways, we can think about artificial intelligence in a similar way, in that, these are systems that are often back-ended, they're databases that you're not engaging with. I mean, we know the so-called megafauna of AI. You see things like, an iPhone. We know that, that's using a lot of AI. We understand that Tesla cars are sort of using AI systems to detect objects. And we can see those things, but in many ways, what's really happening is out of sight. And so for me to try and track the environmental implications of that really was one of the harder research projects that sort of is contained within the book. And it was really transformed by doing Anatomy of an AI System with Ladan Jola, who did this illustration. I always have to give a shout out to him. He's an extraordinary artist and visualizer. And we did this project we started back in 2016, would you believe, trying to trace the full life cycle of a single Amazon Echo. So that meant not just the data pipelines, how it's extracting human voices when you say, Alexa, order me a toilet roll, that's one pipeline. But we decided to find out.
We're sorry to all the people that have ordered toilet rolls now that you're
Yeah,
done.
exactly right. But I mean, it becomes this very common convenience. We don't necessarily think about what it takes to invoke that convenience. So we then went back to sort of what's inside an Amazon Echo. Where did the components come from? Where are they mined? Where's the cobalt and the lithium coming from? How is it smelted? How is it processed? How is it shipped? And then we also looked at the end of life. What happens when these convenience devices get thrown out? And generally it's around sort of 3.7 to 4 years before people discard them. And they go in these big e-waste tips that have this extraordinarily long-lasting toxic legacy in places like Ghana and Pakistan and Malaysia. So, that really for me transformed my thinking to sort of do that work, to sort of trace those supply chains and those environmental impacts from a single device. It was very clear to me that what I needed to do next was to actually expand that, to look at an entire industry and to look at how AI itself is drawing on so many of these in many cases quite limited resources of minerals, rare earth, lithium, cobalt, that are now the focus of, as we've seen, the Biden administration's executive order around critical supply chains. We really are looking at a very real crisis in terms of how we've been acting as though these resources are limitless when they're clearly not.
Well, you also just from reading the book, you physically travel to many of these places, and you look directly upon some of the things that people just don't see. We don't see the enormous server farms. We don't see the mines where this stuff is coming from. I mean, I was reminded of like Langdon Winter's essay that that opens the whale in the reactor, the way that he's looking at a reactor and then he sees a majestic glimpse of nature at the same time. It was and so why did you feel you had to physically go there? Was it just for the fun of exploration, or was there something more to it? I just
no, yeah, I mean, it's a very specific choice, and it is precisely to try and ground artificial intelligence. If we're to see what it takes to make it in this full sense of what it takes to make AI, I think you have to go and see it. I think it's one thing to sort of imagine it, but to see its materiality does require putting yourself, on the line and going to those places, going to places like the last lithium mine in Nevada in Silver Peak, and going inside an Amazon fulfillment warehouse to actually see the physical experience of working in these highly automated environments, to sort of go inside the archives where the types of classifications that machine learning systems use all the time, where did they come from, to also sort of look at those histories. So it was very much if you will, almost a political choice about what it is to say we can no longer ignore the actual origins of these systems and their costs, and to engage with it you kind of have to see it. So that was part of the process for me in writing the book.
So I'd asked you also a bit about what sort of forces obscure all that. I mean, there's the idea that you just, when you experience AI, and by the way, I mean, I just want to be clear, some of this stuff is amazing. My son has a watch that you hit a button on it and he can say something in English, and it translates it into dozens of different languages immediately. I mean, on a watch. I mean, it's amazing, right? So, but you experience that aspect of it, but you don't know what comes from behind. And so, one of the concepts I wanted to ask you about was this concept of enchanted determinism, right? And so, for me, it brought up a couple of things for me. So, one of them was like Sally Wyatt's ideas of like justificatory determinism, where we're like, in order to sort of justify industrial prerogatives, we talk about technology as inevitable. But it wasn't just that. It was also kind of mixed with, I don't know, almost like a sorcerer's apprentice and a goat sort of, or ultimately Fantasia, sorcerer's apprentice narrative about a broom coming alive. And so it's so what is enchanted determinism, and what work is it doing here?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of enchanted determinism comes from a big project that Alex Campolo at the University of Chicago and I did, sort of really tracing the way that artificial intelligence is written about, both in the technical literature but also often in the press, as almost magical, as sort of an alien intelligence. If you look at the way that, when AlphaGo was published, that it was, being described as superhuman. So these descriptions of AI systems as being, completely, enchanted, something very other to sort of to human processes and thought and institutions, but at the same time deterministic, which is to say that they can sort of, intervene and sort of make determinations which are seen as being, profoundly accurate, predictive of, what humans in the world will do. So that combination, I think, of mystification and at the same time a claim towards objectivity and neutrality in technical systems is this sort of very strange sort of response that we see, this pairing that happens quite frequently. And in that dialectic, I think once you start to sort of pull it apart, you see that it has all of these features of actually making people feel unable to intervene or to understand. It's like, well, if these systems are so powerful and yet magical, we can't regulate them, Ryan, or we can't study them, we can't audit them. They're out of reach. They're these sort of extraordinary things that must not be contained. So I think it has a lot of flow-on effects as well, as a way of thinking that certainly, that you and I, over a decade of talking about these issues together, would sort of see that we've lost the thread of how to regulate these systems well. And I think features like that are part of the reason.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the so-called pacing problem. This idea that technology is just too fast for law to keep up, right? But then I'm also reminded that, like, you and I have been in conversation, for example, with the Obama White House in their inaugural workshop on artificial intelligence for well over a decade now, right? And so the issue usually is not so much that that law somehow can't keep up. It's usually that actually there's something else at work. There's some other force, and I just love the idea of enchanted determinism. Really added a lot to my thinking. So the other thing. Oh, please.
No, it's funny because I was thinking about your work in particular, because you wrote, I think it was back in 2017, you wrote an AI policy roadmap. And I was thinking that obviously, sort of, I've been writing an atlas, you wrote a roadmap, these ideas of mapping and understanding sort of the terrains of change, if you will. I'm curious, like, for you in that time, where are we now? Like, if you're thinking about the roadmap, at this point in 2021, have we progressed that far from what you were seeing in 2017?
I mean, I think that we have and we haven't, right? So I would say that, on the one hand, we have abandoned certain, I think, kind of immature discussions, in my own words, in my view, immature discussions about whether AI is going to wake up one day and so I mean, in sort of even though by the way, I absolutely love this film and I recommend it to everybody, but in sort of Mitchell versus the Machines way, you know what I mean, where somehow an AI assistant winds up taking over, and we've moved that conversation to conversations about manipulating consumers, about misinformation being amplified by algorithms and you really, and you and a few others too for sure, but you really helped us see some of the ways in which these systems are also extractive. I'm thinking of literally extracting minerals and having an environmental impact, but also extracting other things, like data and labor and so on. And so I think that people like you and others, of course, who are talking about these issues, have caused us to focus in on the things that are really concerning, right? So I think we've made that move, and I think that's a lovely thing. And I also think that at least some places like Europe, for example, are thinking quite seriously about how we can actually write real rules. And so, so I think, but at the same time, I absolutely believe that the forces you describe in your book are still in full effect. and so I wanted to ask you about some of these things that I just mentioned just now, which is, in addition to the materiality, there's also, I was so fascinated to read some of the connections you are making between um, what you refer to as sort of the logics of AI systems and previous schemes of classification,
Right.
right? And so I wonder if I could get you to talk a little bit about, it's not just about extraction, it's also about this classification, this system of classification that has its own sort of logic and its own sort of consequences. So
Mhm.
could you describe that a little more and what role that plays?
Yeah, no, happy to do so. I mean, if I think about the work that I was doing, gosh, almost 10 years ago now, looking at bias in sort of large data systems, and back then I can remember sort of people saying, "Oh, I mean, bias is going to go away. The more data we have, the more accurate systems will be, and you won't be seeing these sorts of issues of misrepresentation or forms of discrimination." And it's kind of extraordinary to see, what's happened over that time is an enormous amount of research and in journalistic investigations that have shown time and time again that we've had bias in the criminal justice system, in education tools, in hiring tools, and it's really throughout the system. And for me, certainly over the years of doing this work, I think in many ways bias is simply too narrow a term, and I started to look at these sort of classificatory logics, which is to say, how are technical systems being trained on data to recognize the world and to ascribe either characteristics or identity to objects, to people, and to things. And for me, again, the moment that sort of really just blew me away as a researcher working in that space sort of empirically was a collaboration with the artist Trevor Paglen, where we spent 2 years sort of digging through the material layers of training sets. And we spent a lot of time looking at one of the most influential, in fact, ImageNet, which has in its own way been, I would say, probably one of the most well-known training sets, certainly for object recognition. But we started to see these kind of classifications of people in the sort of the subset of these training sets where lots of images have been scraped off the internet of people and put into categories. And some of those categories were things like, gal or father, or in some cases CEO. And then you start to look at the images and you see, oh, CEO, it's mainly white guys. Oh, basketballer, it's mainly black men. Oh, and then you have categories for things that are completely illogical as a visual category, like debtor or kleptomaniac. And then you sort of start to see the way that people are being classified into moral judgments, like that this person is an alcoholic, that this person is a bad person, it's just extraordinary, some of the terms. And then you get absolutely shocking, racialized, gendered slurs sort of throughout. And for me to be like, wow, this is a system that has been so influential for over a decade and has informed so many production systems that are out there today, and yet had these classificatory logics that had gone unexamined and uncritiqued and sort of just accepted. So the more that we start to look at that, we start to see that AI systems are doing this all the time. Systems like this, when we're on video chat, can be very easily used to say, oh, well, we'll put you into gender categorizations. They'll say, oh, if you have long hair, you're a woman, or if you have a beard, you're a man. And again, why are we using these binary gender assumptions? Same with racial categories. Again, the way that the systems are being used to sort of categorize people according to things like skin tone. This has a dark past. I mean, this connects to both kind of histories around physiognomy and phrenology, but also in terms of just like racialized and gender classifications that are done by centralized systems. So in the book, I sort of give a shout out to the work of Jeff Bowker and Susan Lee Starr in their extraordinary book, Sorting Things Out, which have looked at how classifications make people and how people's lives are then changed by those classifications. So you have this sort of looping effects, and that is now being centralized inside technical systems. It's a long answer, but for me, shifting this debate away from kind of the whack-a-mole of, oh, we found another bias system, to be like, why is this happening? Let's look at that underlying classificatory logic. And I think that asks much bigger epistemological questions around how AI systems are constructing knowledge and what feedback loops that's creating.
Yeah, I mean, ImageNet is a fascinating example, and as you say, underpins like, I mean, an unbelievable range of computer vision and recognition. I mean, but I was struck by, just for example, how much is premised on mugshots, right? Just because what's available, like what's legible. And I want to ask you a follow-up question too, which is, I'm reminded. I'm sorry, I've joked about this before on Twitter, but I'm becoming insufferable because I'm reading a lot of STS, and so all my references are going to be. I'm like your friend who just learned STS, in the last couple of years. But I'm sort of reminded of the story about the tomato harvesters, right? Where all of a sudden efficiency is important. There's not enough people. People don't have enough food, so we're going to use these machines, and we're going to make tomato harvesting much more efficient. But then, of course, the story is that for that to work, tomatoes had to be firmer, and we had to, because otherwise too many would be destroyed. And so that did affect the taste, but it made them more durable. And so therefore, this machine solution could reach fruition, even though it forever, sort of changed what most people think of as a tomato. And I was struck by the realization that we have done that to an enormous degree with emotion recognition, right? And so that chapter on emotion was just, it really brought a lot of things together for me, that I hadn't thought of before. But I wonder if you could talk about why did you treat emotions separately? Like, what was it about, right? And like, what is the story of emotional recognition? What does that layer into our understanding about AI systems?
Right. I mean, for me, the reason why, emotion and affect recognition, as it's called in various places, is such an important example, because it allowed me in particular to sort of dig into the history of an idea. And so what I did is sort of really sit very, very closely with the work of Paul Ekman, who's a psychologist who back in the 1960s was very influenced by Sylvan Tompkins, who had thought about this idea of the affects, that there were sort of universal affects that we had that were shared regardless of, what culture you were in, how old you were, what sort of person you were, whether you were in relation to someone or not. And so he had this idea that there were 6 universal emotions, and he tried to sort of evidence that by going to places like Papua New Guinea and sort of, showing remote tribes, these headshots to try and, again, with a person who'd never done kind of cross-cultural research, had all of these kinds of problems trying to do that. But the idea really caught on, and, despite the fact that it's had critics since the beginning, anthropologists like Margaret Mead really critiqued the idea that there were universal emotions that were always legible on the face, regardless of, culture, context, and relationality. But when it started to get picked up by computer vision, there's a shift, which is this idea that you've got a very simple taxonomy of 6, although some expand it to 7 or 8, and that it can be read from the face, and that you can essentially read people's interior states. And there's a real shift that happens there. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to understand in the process of researching this book is, how is it that so many psychologists and scholars for years have said that, it's not as simple as that. This one-to-one translation between facial movements and interior states doesn't exist, that it's been adopted so uncritically in machine learning. You will see Ekman sort of cited as though this is just the field, this is how it works. And so it led me on this historical journey, but it also led me through thinking about, what are the points that drive systems like this to be constructed. And certainly Ekman's own work was heavily funded by the military at sort of various points in his career. And we start to see after September 11 the desire for states to have that ability to sort of see into your interiority, to see if you're a potential terrorist, for example. And these systems continue to fail. They don't work. They are driven by this phrenological impulse, to know more about somebody than they're prepared to reveal. So to really trace that and to see how, in some ways, the theories have been adopted if they suit what the tools can do. And so we have to be really careful when these kinds of models are adopted uncritically into machine learning that ultimately narrow our understanding of humans in an incredibly infinitely complex world.
Yeah, I mean, that helps to sort of, it helps to dig a little deeper, as you pointed out, about, one of the ways that we've reached the relatively, sober-eyed, mature understanding we have of the potential harm of AI has been indeed through researchers, through journalists, litigators, right?
Yeah,
I mean, people people actually suing to discover how algorithms work and so on. And the examples that you tend to highlight, or one tends to highlight, are real and visceral and important, right? And so it is no mistake, it is no coincidence that the people who are being falsely arrested under facial recognition are Black men. I mean, that has everything to do with the carceral state and the context in which it arises. I've also heard stories about people, like, for example, Asian Americans who are trying to use cameras to take a selfie, and the system is telling them that their face is doing something that it's not doing. You know what I mean? Because their face wasn't part of the training set, and so the system's making assumptions about what they're doing and telling them to correct their behavior, right? But it helps to understand the logic behind these systems and the way in which, I mean, if you assume that around something like affect there aren't cultural distinctions, then it's perfectly fine to have some kind of essentializing model that's developed in one context and deployed everywhere. But once you understand that that very assumption is, I mean, like so many things in your book, it just really gave me just a deeper appreciation of things that I already had intuitions around, but I just had not made the connections.
Right. I mean, what I love about this moment is that, there are lots of scholars out there who are actually illuminating different parts of this very complex set of technical systems that we have, and I think of people here like Ruha Benjamin and Alondra Nelson and Lucy Suchman, and, there's this Sophia Noble. I mean, the list is long now of scholars that have been bringing us ways of looking at the underlying racialized, gendered, and class logics. I mean, here I'm also thinking of Virginia Eubanks's work, looking at how poverty itself is seen as being a problem, a thing that's sort of classified immediately into technical systems as a red flag. I mean, the way that those normalizing and essentializing visions of who is the average citizen and how should they behave and what is sort of correct behavior, those norms are being built into really essentially a set of scoring systems that can have profound impacts on everything from hiring to insurance to criminal justice. So how do you start to see those? And that to me is really the fundamental democratic question that we're also facing here, that these are not systems that are coming from, in many cases, public entities. They're coming from private companies, for-profit companies that, are protected by laws that allow them not, in many cases, to even show us how these systems work. It's proprietary, and yet have effects on populations of billions of people now, and we're not seeing how those sorts of normalizing and essentializing functions are working. So I think for me, that's why there's an urgency here now, and why I think we're seeing such a shift of many scholars now raising the alarm. But you could also sort of point to the fact that I'm thinking of people like Oscar Gandy, who was writing about the panoptic sort. Sure. Now, decades back, you could see where this was going, but there is this, as you say, speed now and scaling, this desire to take these ideas and scale them to large numbers of people that I think raises very serious political questions for all of us.
I mean, I remember years ago, you and I sat down and wrote together in Nature about the need for a social systems approach, right? Right. And I wonder whether have we gotten there? What has sort of changed since we were sort of making a diagnosis that a lot of the research wasn't looking at social systems as a whole?
Right. I mean, and I remember that really well because we had that sort of fantastic sort of deep dive time of just looking at AI research, and we thought about it as there's a blind spot here. There's an extraordinary blind spot by focusing just on sort of technical innovation, and even if there are sort of issues of bias, etc., that's seen as something that can be fixed technically by either sort of removing a problematic category, as we saw with the sort of the Google Gorilla case, where Google's image markup systems are actually using extraordinarily offensive terms for African Americans. We can also look at the ways in which people say, oh, well, we'll just diversify data sets by, getting people from different parts of the world and photographing them and taking their data. I mean, what we try to say is this is not enough. We actually need this much broader approach of a social systems analysis to see how these technical systems are actually interacting with our institutions, with populations, and more broadly, I'd have to say, with ecologies. Not something that we looked at specifically then, but I think, again, trying to thread that through. Have we got there? Well, I mean, you have to say that the conversations in the technical field are opening up a little. We're starting to realize that there's certainly more questions that need to be asked. But I think we have a long way to go. I'm curious what you think, though. I noticed that you brought this up in this fantastic article you wrote recently with Danielle Citron, looking at how the administrative state is using these types of automated decision services, and that you're saying we still need these forms of social systems analysis that we don't have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that time we spent together writing and thinking was absolutely incredibly influential on me and my work. And so what Danielle Citron and I were marveling at was how adept legal and policy scholars, including you and I and Danielle, had been at identifying the ways in which trying to replicate human decision-making with algorithms and software would take away opportunities for due process and opportunities to challenge and to engage, and this idea that we were substituting what people did with machines, and it would erode the kinds of constitutional and statutory guarantees you're supposed to have when governments make decisions about you. Mm-hmm. But then we backed out a little bit, and we sort of thought about it from a more systemic vantage point, and we started to think about the way in which the administrative state, agencies, federal agencies, state agencies in the United States and abroad, their whole existence, their justification is the idea that they're going to be repositories of expertise, and that they're going to have the kind of dynamism and discretion and nimbleness to respond to real people's problems on the ground, right? Mm-hmm. And here they are taking that expertise and that discretion because they're overwhelmed, because they're underfunded, right? And throwing it away with both hands by trying to replicate the decision-making processes that have been committed to that. And that was a real light bulb moment for both of us. As you know, Danielle wrote the piece on this technological due process years and years ago. So yeah, I do think there's a number of people making those kinds of moves these days. And it's good to see. I actually want to ask you a follow-up question. It's very much related to this. So what I've noticed in all, and there's been so many positive, lovely reviews and people attesting to your book. And one of the things I've seen is that people have glommed onto this sentence, right? A couple people have glommed on the sentence where you say something like, and I'm just sort of paraphrasing, we say something like, we need to stop focusing so much on ethics and focus on power. Mm. Right? Stop focusing so much on ethics to focus on power. And I really wanted to take this chance to just ask you, what were you getting at with that statement? Because and I'll give you a little more context, which is, isn't a maldistributions of power about moral ethics, right? At some level, So what were you getting at when you were saying, let's stop talking about ethics, let's start talking about power?
Right. Yeah. And it appears in the book in sort of a chapter specifically dedicated to power and how we might think about power differently in AI. And it's certainly sort of a thread throughout my work over the last decade, really is trying to focus less on these ideas of narrow interpretations of technical effects and broader structural issues of how power is distributed and centralized in ways in society, but also amplified by these sorts of technical systems. And in particular, that moment in the book is referring to what we've been seeing just over the last 5 years, which is as we've started to hear more and more criticisms of technical systems producing sort of discriminatory results and disempowering particularly marginalized communities and re-enriching and re-empowering those who are already powerful, that one of the responses we've seen, particularly from the tech sector itself, is the creation of ethical guidelines. It's like, oh, well, we now have a set of ethical guidelines to decide what we should do. We saw this with Google in particular after the scandal around Project Maven, and created a sort of a gigantic uproar within the company. That the company's response was to sort of create these ethical principles. Now
that was the realization with Maven, for those who may not be familiar, that some of the systems at Google were being deployed in drone targeting and identification, at least target identification.
Yeah. Always when we're talking about drones, I'm always like deep in your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Right?
That's my wheelhouse, so to speak.
Exactly.
My road house.
And we've seen that there are now hundreds of ethical codes for AI that have been produced by industry bodies, by companies, by scholars. It has become almost sort of this go-to approach. And what troubles me about that is that it's not back-ended with any sort of type of actual accountability or regulatory framework. And it becomes sort of used almost as a cipher for self-regulation. That if we've got these ethical guidelines, then self-regulation can work. We don't need actual laws. And frankly, to me, we've seen the failures of that already. And instead, by looking at who becomes more powerful by the use of a particular system. And to really understand that, we need to sort of unpack the way in which AI systems come with particular types of logics baked into them. And again, this is something that I look at in the book in terms of as a historical perspective. The ways of seeing that these tools actually enhance are the ways of seeing that are deployed as advertising logics by large companies, as sort of policing and sort of militarized logics. We could talk about Palantir here as well. So these sorts of forms of centralizing power and centralizing the ability to classify, to score, and to determine opportunities for other people. That is the shift that I think we need to make, that I'm sort of referring to there. And it has a really long history. I mean, doing a sort of power analysis, we can go back to, half of the 20th century's philosophers were dealing with this. Particularly, we could talk about Foucault, we could talk about Simondon, but honestly, most importantly is how do we get the field to start thinking about when a system is being constructed, does it in fact just empower the already powerful, or does it find new ways of actually changing those asymmetries?
So this is a bit of a curveball, I'm going to be honest with you, but so I've been reading a lot of work about the relationship between law and policy and normativity, and in particular the work of Robin West at Georgetown in her book Normative Jurisprudence. And an observation that she's made is that it's important to map power. It's important to show where power is, where it isn't, and how the law, for example, in her field, and but also our field, there are ways in which law and legal institutions tend to perpetuate power, tend to obscure power, obfuscate power. But that doesn't tell us at a normative level where power distributions are problematic, right? And so we can certainly, I know you and I and most people are committed to, for example, anti-racism. So when you see power reside in just one ethnicity and not in another, you can look at that and you can say this is normatively wrong, right? It's because I can point to values about equality, right? But I do think at a minimum, it's my own view, is at a minimum, you have to show where power is, you have to locate it, you have to map it, because otherwise you cannot have that conversation about whether the balance is appropriate, right? And I think that my own concern about ethical principles, if I may, is simply that they're often these soaring concepts that no serious person would disagree with, right? Does anybody want AI not to be safe or fair, right? And so
Yeah. So, I love that you're raising this way, because fundamentally, ethics is necessary to this field, but it's not sufficient. And I think that's the piece that is really clear. And certainly by talking about power, we're invoking ways of thinking about fundamental ethical relations, but it's outside of this kind of narrow idea of the ethical principle of like, be excellent to each other, keep AI safe. It's like, well, what does that actually mean in practice when we know that these systems are having these really sort of profound interventions that are widening inequality, and we can see that across multiple vectors.
Yeah, there isn't a silver lining, I suppose, or I think there's a bit of a silver lining, which is that that enchanted determinism, where these things are magical, right? When you begin to sort of reveal how these enchanted brooms that you thought were going to help you clean up before the sorcerer came back, in fact, were out of control and doing terrible things, and of course non-trivial things, deleterious things. It does at least open people's eyes to the embeddedness of things like heteronormativity and racism and the like. So one question I have for you, and this is not an easy one, I guess, and no softballs here, but is, well, imagine that you're a student or
Mm.
you're an early career researcher, right? And you have to navigate this world. And this is also responsive to a question we got from the live stream, which is, what kinds of advice would you give, or how would you begin to think about navigating this environment, given the logics of the systems you're working with, the financial and political incentives of the people you're working with. What would you, to people who want to get into AI or early in their careers in AI, what would you say, Kate?
Right. And for me, like it's such a timely question right now, because I think the field is in a crisis moment, sort of deciding where can you do your best work, and will tech companies allow you to really kind of publish critical research? Will they allow you to try to intervene, to think about systems differently? And so this is a really live debate at this precise moment. And I think one of the things we're starting to see is that actually for students now who are studying these systems, you have more power than you think, and you can actually talk to your professors and say, let's start to sort of draw different sorts of bodies of knowledge into these questions. Let's actually start to study what happens when you apply technical systems to existing social institutions. These are questions that have predominantly lived within like the social sciences, within law, within STS, within sociology, but you can actually start to incorporate those. And I think in many ways for students now, it's like, how do you widen the ways of seeing and escape that type of tunneling effect that is so common? And also historically, we have to think about the ways in which computer science and engineering have not seen themselves as social disciplines, as disciplines that are fundamentally about how they were affecting people's lives. We cannot say that anymore. Like, these are profoundly political and social systems. So, I think for students thinking about that, first of all, is like, how do you study them? How do you think about their construction? How do you think about their longevity and their broader costs in terms of how they're constructed? Environmental costs, labor costs, data costs. But then in terms of like, where do you think about the field and where to work? That now I think is a question where people are asking much harder questions, and they're less likely to be like, tech jobs are straightforward and we're saving the world. And I think that that's actually a really good shift. I think we're sort of starting to sort of move away from that tech utopianism to be more aware, and I think skeptical, that just because you've created a new app that's harvesting a lot of data, that everyone should just trust that that's completely fine. So I think those conversations in some ways have become a lot more nuanced and advanced, and that's something that I'm really optimistic about.
Yeah, I am too. And I know that you've spent nearly all of your professional career, at least connected to the academy, if not, in a research or teaching role. And so one of the questions that we got also from the live stream was around the role of a university. And I just want to sort of preface this with saying that we think about this constantly. Like, so we, the Tech Policy Lab, we're trying to create materials that you can use in technical classes. But I think that the concern is, how do you make it endure? How do you make it sticky?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can make everybody read Technology, Society, Be Durable. No, actually, I wouldn't inflict that on people, but everybody can read, certain texts, and walk away with a sort of profound aha moment. But how do you make it endure, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that can, just as ethical principles might be a kind of superficial, my own words, a superficial way to address some of these concerns in the industrial space. So could just sort of throwing a couple of readings about Foucault, about this, or about in STS or whatever. So I guess, I mean, not that I'm asking you to solve all this hard problem, but I mean, it seems to me like it's a distinct research question.
Yep.
Right? How can what is the role of universities in ensuring that people who graduate and then end up working in this field have those perspectives and tools? Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. We do. We've been talking about this a lot. I know you and I sort of think a lot about this question too. So I am ultimately going to flip this question back to you as well. But in the first instance, I think we also have to be super careful that these kinds of debates don't just become absorbed back into computer science, where it's like, oh, well, now we'll just sort of read the whale in the reactor, or we'll start to talk about STS, and that's it. Now you've graduated, right? That actually we this is the problem, both around siloization at the university, but how knowledge itself has to be, I think, in many ways, sort of brought from completely different perspectives, and that is challenging at universities. Universities aren't designed that way. They've been designed, since the 1500s to be sort of very specifically around domains, and you stay in your domain. And I think that's in many cases what we're up against. Another thing that we're up against is, we are talking ultimately here about the workings of capital, how AI itself is, I think, a phenomenon that's really only possible because of the kind of extraordinary amounts of wealth that certain companies have and certain individuals have. So you're looking at something that is itself an outgrowth of a phase of capitalism itself, and while at the same time, I think, is again ratcheting that up, sort of ramping up those very types of inequalities that we've been talking about. So how at universities can you start to study that, intervene, at the very least conceptualize those sort of deeper political and economic shifts? That is something that I think also needs to be done, and it's going to be hard to be done in a siloed way. But tell me, Ryan, how do you address this? Because I know this is something that is core to the Tech Policy Lab. You've been wrestling with this for years.
Yeah, it's so a lot of what we do at the Tech Policy Lab is put together interdisciplinary teams. And my own belief, and this is not necessarily shared universally, but my own belief is that, you can't do interdisciplinary work without disciplines. That is to say that, you do need some specificity. People need to be trained in a methodology, and it's or one or more, and you can't simply train everybody in everything. And so, when we put together interdisciplinary teams, a lot of the focus is on being able to communicate across disciplines, being able to set common goals, being able to, and it's through some of these projects that are alumni of the lab. It's just like the longer I'm in academia, the more I just am mostly excited about the people that come through my shop and our shops here and do great things. They learn that kind of fluency. They learn how to talk to other people. They learn how to bring in perspectives. And so we have had, I think, I hope and expect that we've had some success with this, but it's like been like dozen people at a time kind of thing, right? And so I don't know. I don't know how to, and I've asked a lot of people about this. There was one person I asked who was in STS, and he said he's tried everything, but he assigns this great essay about how intentional the Amish are about using technology. And this one essay has, for some reason, really gotten through to his students and stuck with them years later. And I said, you need to send me that essay, right? And so I read it and I agree, so maybe there's some interesting artifacts lying about there that could help. But there's no magical talisman. I mean, this has gone, of course, as I might expect, really, really fast. And there's a couple more things I do want to ask you about, if I may. So I'm going to try to sneak them in. But so one is, we've been really talking about the responsibility of junior people. We've been talking about industry's role. But I mean, what about government? Right? I mean, what about government? Right? I mean, my view is that. And this is something that you and I have talked about many times. I think I might even be stealing your line, so I apologize. But the idea is that, I believe you've said to me that, it's amazing how proponents of AI, right, say like that this is going to change everything. This is going to change everything. But nothing should change. Right? There should be no meaningful changes to law or legal institutions, even though this is the transformative technology of our time, and it's going to change everything except for the people that, And so, like, I wonder, like, are we at a point where it's starting to be really fair to ask? I get it. It's not easy to regulate AI. It's not a thing. You know what I mean? Like, I understand all that, but like, what kinds of real meaningful legal interventions might be appropriate today?
Right. And you know, again, I love talking about this with you, Ryan, because for me, the sort of standout moments over the last decade have been when we've kind of had really granular conversations where we've looked at different regimes and said, you know, this isn't working. And part of it is, I think, exactly what you said, that there has been this movement saying these are transformative technologies, but they should not be transformed at the level of law. You know, don't think about regulation. And then you see what just happened last month with the EU's proposed guidelines for regulating AI. And you know, it has to be commended for attempting to come up with omnibus legislation that would actually deal with all of these questions. And you certainly see the kind of most hotly debated areas referenced there, you know, in terms of facial recognition at scale, in terms of emotion recognition, which is sort of specifically called out as an area of concern, and certainly in terms of training sets, in terms of these substrates of technical systems, again, now being thought of as something that requires a sort of a regulatory framework. This is all good, but unfortunately, what I think you see there is a real over-reliance on transparency, right? So that if you walk into a shopping mall and you see a sign that says, oh, our systems are doing emotion recognition, have a nice day. You know, it's not like you have the option to say, I don't want these systems used when I do a job interview, or I don't want them used in my school. Again, that ability to refuse to opt out is very sort of, I think, underbaked in these kinds of regulatory frameworks. And in some ways, I think, don't give us enough to work with. And of course, you know, you would know better than I what happens when that moves into all of the different legislatures that are actually going to start to work with that for the EU. But I'm curious what you think. I mean, I feel like we're really far behind where we should be, and that innovation in the technical space has been lionized far more than innovation in the legal space.
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and I think, I mean, my own hope in the United States, because the truth of the matter is that, you know, the US typically does not have the European appetite for omnibus legislation that covers a bunch of different things. But I will say that that, you know, there is the Brussels effect, to so to speak, is also real, right? And so some of the states in the United States are paying attention, and in the US government is paying attention to some degree. But there's just really huge differences. But I think what Europe is modeling is, you know, even if these are not the exact rules that wind up governing, right? Even if people convince them that this is not enough, this is too much, they put something on the table, right? They've said, and in a sense, in that way, Europe has taken AI more seriously than the United States. And so for me, I think a lot of the things that we could change in the US have to do with just improving the ecosystem. The way we know about many of the animating examples, and I've also read this in many an AI Now report, so it's not lost on me that you know this too. But in many of the animating examples, the reason we know them is because some whistleblower or some researcher figured out that something was doing something and it shouldn't be doing, or that we thought was abhorrent once it was brought to light. And yet, you know, researchers are facing literal cease and desist orders from huge household name companies, telling them not to telling them to stop their research because it's problematic to them. And so, you know, one thing we could do, for example, and there's a number of different examples like this, is we could make sure to protect internal and external accountability research, right? And that's a change that's needed and concrete, and it doesn't require you to sort of pretend that AI is a thing like a train that you can just regulate, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, you know, again, if there's something that gives me enormous optimism and hope, it's that, you know, we have an Alondra Nelson in the White House with the title of Science and Society, right? So immediately putting these frameworks, you know, outside of just looking at sort of the technical domains, but to start to say these have wider social contexts, political contexts, ecological contexts that we have to account for. So, you know, in that sense, already the conversation has shifted. I mean, who knew that infrastructure would be the hot topic for 2021 if we'd been talking about this 2 years ago? So, you know, in that sense, I think that there's better ground conditions, and we have to, I think, look at that EU moment as something to be grateful for putting it on the table. As you say, it's not perfect yet, but we're now starting to have that conversation around what would it look like if we had better regulatory regimes in the US, but also around the world. This is a bigger question.
Do you have time for that? Can I ask you one more question? Because I just
Totally.
really
For
want
you,
this one,
Ryan,
I want to ask you. Oh, I appreciate that. I'm
Totally.
gonna play a card, the friend card. So, I mean, and I just want to acknowledge, I mean, right, having someone like Alondra Nelson, who's an STS and race and, and technology scholar of renown, you know what I mean? Like being in the White House is amazing. Having, frankly, Lynn Parker, who's had all that time at NSF and has been so instrumental in getting the humanities involved in technical research. I mean, these are good things, right? So the question I want to ask you, though, is completely unrelated. I just have to ask you, which is that your book, spoiler alert, sort of ends in an interesting place. It ends with this coda, and the coda is about, drum roll, it's about space exploration. It's about space exploration. And it's about the idea that there's going to be this privatized space race where billionaires compete to be, and I wanted to know, like, what led you to sort of put a coda on this and to end on that note? And what do you think that it says? Like, what do you think that this story about the space race that we're looking at next, maybe your next book, I don't know, but the point is, like, what work is that doing for you? And we'll end there.
Well, I mean, in so many ways, this book is tracing, from the very surface of the earth through labor, through data, through classification, through affect, through the state, how these kinds of technical systems are deeply imbricated in forms of capital and extraction. And where does that end up, Ryan? Well, look at the people who've made the most money out of the tech sector. What are the tech billionaires doing? We've got Jeff Bezos, we've got Elon Musk, we have multiple people in the tech space now spending all of that money, just vast amounts of money, in creating this privatized space race. And I think it tells us something in multiple ways. It points to something really profound in terms of, what is the vision? You've made billions of dollars and now you're going to leave the earth. You're going to say, that's it. Now I'm out of here.
I'm out.
I've got what I wanted. I'm out. What kind of vision does that have in terms of sort of responsibility to the planet on which we live, the only planet on which we know can sustain life in this way? So there's that. But there's actually something interesting too that I know that you've thought about too, which is if we look at sort of legal domains around public goods. So you can think about the Enclosure Acts. You could think about the way in which land was sort of shifted into private property. Space has always been seen as a commonly owned good. It's a collectively owned space by all of us. And actually what we've started to see is an erosion of that. We've started to see sort of the emergence of mining as the next, as a space question, that you could go and sort of mine asteroids. And we're starting to also see that idea that, this is actually, again, an enclosure of that space by the richest men in the world. And I saw that, for me, the last journey that I go on in the book is going to go and see Blue Origin, the reusable rocket base that Jeff Bezos owns in this huge desert expanse in West Texas. And, I'd done the research to figure out, where's the public land where you can stand and look and photograph this base. And even there, I started to see that, I was being watched and people were coming to check me out. And I was like, you are not welcome here. And it was such a perfect analogy for that idea of this loss of the commons that is happening across the board, that everything has been captured and harvested for private companies and for profit from, our histories, our data, the space of the earth, and now outer space itself. So that's why, I really end there, because I think it points to the way that these logics extend, and I think we should be really concerned about them.
Well, thank you, and we're going to end there too. But thank you so much for coming here. Thank you for this just magisterial book. I mean, it's wonderful. What an accomplishment, and thank you so much for spending this time with us. So we're going to end our live stream here, and hopefully everybody gets a chance to check this book out for themselves. And thank you again, and thank you for being such a great research partner and mentor over the years.
Ryan, you're an absolute mensch and a gem, and thank you for all that you do for this field. You make us all wiser and smarter all the time. So thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.